Hello everyone, it's another Friday and another fundamentals video. For today's episode, I'll be going into an animation technique known as secondary motions. Put simply, secondary animations are movements that happen after your object or character has finished their primary animation, or because of those animations. Another way to look at these is that animations are cause and effect, with these secondary animations being the effect. An example of this would be a cube sitting in a scene. Another cube comes rushing in and smacks into it. If you just have primary animation, you might have the first cube sliding in and overlapping the second. When you then make that second cube slide away as though it's been hit, that's the secondary animation. And there are a ton of different effects you can do for secondary animations. It adds a sense of realism to your scene. Even if you're making cartoons, you always want to shoot for having things feel like they're all part of the same world, which is why this is so important to know. To start with, let's talk about physics and how objects would react with each other. For our first effect, say we want to have an object seem very light and bouncy. How do we do that? For my example, I've shown it by making the cube move really fast at the side of the frame, and then got the weight across by having that cube bounce off an assumed wall. This process involved a couple animation techniques. First, the build up to the cube's run. I'm sure there's a name for this, but I just call it pull and release. I call it that because I first set a keyframe, move a little forward in the timeline, and pull the object to the side as though it were a runner priming their legs so they can push off. I then move forward even more in the timeline, and place another keyframe so that the object's frozen until then. Lastly, I move forward one more time and release the object, dragging its position forward as though it's taken off or been shot from a slingshot. This would be the same kind of thing you would do if you wanted text or some kind of graphic to seem like it's shooting off the screen. So then I get into the bounce effect when the cube actually hits the wall or barrier. First, I move several frames forward after the running animation's finished and drag the object's position to where I want it to end up hitting the ground. This is what happens if your object crashes into the wall and is sent sliding back, and that in itself might be what you want. But it was just the first part of what I wanted here. Say you want the object to bounce up high, like I did. There's actually a really easy way to do this. First, we move back in the timeline between the start and end points of our motion. Go to wherever you'll have the cube at the highest or lowest part of its arc, and drag the layer up or down to where you want it. Alternatively, you can use the Y position setting on the layer down in the timeline and move it that way. Once again though, we now have a different kind of effect. If I wanted the cube to bounce off a roof, the hard angle of the motions right now would work for that. Again, not what I was going for, but it could work for you. So for me, I went on to the last part of this movement by giving it an arc. A simple way for me to do this is select the keyframes for this motion and right-click on one of those frames. In the menu, you can then select the keyframe interpolation and change its interpolation from linear to Bezier. What this does is changes the straight lines of motion into curved lines, allowing more circular movement. You can also do this manually with the pen tool by choosing the pen tool or pressing G and clicking on any point in the motion path. This will add a keyframe at that point in the motion's timeline. You can then hold down Command or Control and click on that point and change where the position at that point will be. Holding down Option or Alt and dragging on the same point will then also make it into a Bezier curve, creating two handles to control how the object will curve in its motions. You can move those handles to control the width and angle of the arc, and if you hold down Option or Alt and drag on one of the handles, you can then change both handles separately. Now that's much more like what I had in mind, but again, the two steps before this might also have been what you were looking to do, depending on the effect you're going for. So my cube now gets ready, runs, and bounces up off the wall to give the cube a sense of weight and speed. I could then push the effect further by adding more bounces and rolls on the cube after it lands until it's off the frame. All of this looks like it has way more physics than if I had just had the cube slide and get stopped by the side of the frame. And it's just one example of combining secondary animations. Say, instead of the previous example, we wanted a really heavy cube this time. One way to show that is through impacts. For instance, here's the exact same light cube from last scene. For the sake of argument, let's assume there was no previous scene telling you that it's very light, so you just think that it's a regular cube. And here's a heavy cube, which we'll know is heavy because it's going to crush the first cube. But really, all this is doing right now is covering the first with the second, or even just having it fall closer to the camera and blocking it from view. It doesn't really get a heavy feeling from this. With a few secondary animations though, we can fix that. First, let's make it seem like the first cube was in fact crushed. To do this, I first move back in the timeline to the frame before the second cube touches the edges of the first. That's where I go to the first cube and set a keyframe on its scale, either by rolling down the menu or clicking S and then hitting the stopwatch. Before we animate the cube though, we need to fix two things now before they get tedious later. The first is that we need to click on the chain link next to the scale properties numbers. With this chain link on, the X, Y, and if it's a 3D layer, Z scales will all change uniformly, which, if something's being crushed from the top, isn't typically what would happen. With the link off, we can control the X, Y, and Z scales individually, going from left to right in that order. To start though, we'll keep everything at 100%. The second problem we have to fix was just shown when I was scaling things. The cube scaled in both directions from its center, seeming to leave the ground as it did. As I've gone over in my 3D rotator how-to video, we fixed this by changing the layer's anchor point. We can manually adjust this in the layers controls, but a much more efficient way is to use the pan behind tool, which we activate with the 4 arrow button at the top of AE, or by pressing Y. With the pan behind tool active, we drag the anchor point down to the bottom of the cube. We can also hold shift while dragging down to move it in a perfectly straight line to the bottom. With this anchor point at the bottom like this, changing the Y scale will now scale it down from the top, pulling it higher or lower while the bottom will stay the same. With these two things done and the original scale how I want it, I then move to where the second cube ends up and animate the first cube's Y scale down to 0. But right now, if we move to the midpoint of the animation, it looks like we haven't actually changed anything from the original one where we didn't do any scale changes. But let's say we go back to the last keyframe and change something else. So I can see what I'm doing, I put the Y scale back up a bit, temporarily. I then animate the X scale up slightly as well, stretching things out. The reason I do that is that now, instead of just covering the first cube down, it seems like the cube is bowing under a weight. Then I put the Y scale to 0. This will now make it seem more like the second cube is crushing the first. But it still, at least for me, isn't quite there yet. Again, you might be doing something very different where this would be enough, but what I'm going for is really exaggerated weight. I can add a couple more animations to the cube to give it that sense of weight. First of these is shaking effects, as though something really heavy has impacted the ground. Giving something this kind of effect is actually really relatively easy in terms of what you need to animate. Shaking, in animation terms, is just rapidly changing the positions. For an animation where you're giving something an impact, you'll generally want to go to right when the previous animation ends and the object or characters right where you want them. From that spot, go forward a few frames and move the object's position to where you want it. My animation will just be moving in the X position, but you can also use the Y and Z for various bouncing effects to go with the shaking. Depending on how violent you want the impact to be, you can keep moving forward a few frames at a time and move it left or right. It should be noted that at first you might push the positions too far and make it look like it's landing and sliding instead. I try to keep it as close as possible to where the object first hits. In fact, I'll tend to find a position to the left and right of the starting point and copy those frames by selecting them and hitting Command or Control C. I then move forward a few frames and paste the keyframes with Command or Control V. I do this a few times before finally copying the keyframe where the impact first happened and pasting it at the end of the shake so it goes back into that position. It now looks like the objects hit the ground hard, but once again, we can do more with it if we want, like I did. Going back to what I've covered in my rotator animation how-to, we can go back in the timeline to right before the shaking starts and parent background objects to our cube. This will make it seem like the background shakes with the hit, which adds even more weight and depth to the effect as a whole. And we can go even further. One last thing we can do is give the whole effect some motion blur. To do this, activate the same switches that let you see the 3D layer boxes on your layers. To the left of the 3D cube symbol is an icon of 3 spheres, which will let you give layers motion blur when they have fast animations. One issue though is that if you just turn that on and run the animation, there still won't be any motion blur. For this effect to work, you need to go to the top of your timeline right before your layers turns into the timeline proper and activate the switch that will enable motion blur for the composition as a whole. Now we put all that together and it looks like our cube is really crushing the first. Even better, all of these things I've just gone over can easily be used for different effects with some minor tweaks. The same things that can be used to make it seem like a cube is bouncing or crushing something else can also be used to make something launch into a scene and skid to a stop. Keep in mind that all these techniques, while shown with simple blocks of color, can and often are applied to kinetic type, images, and animations over footage. And I also did all of this with just the basic layer properties. You can get really complex reactions when you add some particle effects like sparks or shattering. You also probably noticed by now that these animations are all about layering one effect on top of the other for better, more realistic depth to the whole thing. And this is just a couple of the many different kinds of secondary animations. Which is why, as usual, I recommend experimenting, trying to figure out how to combine the techniques I've gone over for any reactions you need, and if you can come up with the reaction you need, figuring out how to make it. As always, I hope you've all learned something and enjoyed yourself doing it. If you have any questions, thoughts, or other feedback, you can let me know with a comment down below. You can also like this video and share it around, which helps with Google's rankings, and I'm planning to be back here every Friday, so be sure to subscribe for more awesome content. Have a great day, everyone.